We begin right where we left off at the end of the last video. All of these pieces have been basted around the exterior edges and now they're ready to be assembled. Since we're working our way from the smallest pieces to the largest pieces, we'll begin by sewing the side back seams of the skirts together. Now this style of skirt has center back left open, so don't sew that seam, just sew the seam for the side back. Now also we've basted these together in a much more fast way with a diagonal baste down the center, so we don't have to worry about the basting around the edges. We'll go around and bind those later. At the same time, you want to do exactly the same seam on the lining so that we can put those together as we work. Once we've sewn those short seams and they've been pressed open at the iron, then we'll align the lining with the exterior and then we'll hem the center back edge. We'll just fold a little bit of the silk back and then lay the lining on top and fell it into place. Now the sleeve is not interlined and is quite soft, but we need the wrist area to have some support. And one of the ways that's achieved in extant examples is by using an extra layer of fabric. This is kind of a dense twill woven worsted wool that I'm using as the interlining here, but a piece of linen canvas will suffice if that's all you have. It's laid behind the silk and then basted in place from the outside. And once it's basted in place, then the edges are turned in carefully and pressed. Make sure you've checked the length of the sleeve against the arm it's supposed to go on. Once you have the sides and the bottom of the wrist area turned in place, then we stitch them down with catch stitches as shown here. Repeat the pressing process with the lining, but in this case we're going to press the bottom up first and the sides in second. This gives us the opportunity to nest the corner in very nice and neatly, as you can see here. So we are putting the bottom is going to be properly aligned and then the sides are going to get tucked in this way, and then we can baste them in place. But you see how nice and tidy and clean that is, and that's what we want. Once we've got that in place, then we baste across the opening, baste across the bottom, and baste along the opposite side. After that, then we can fell the edges down. So we put the basting in place just to keep pins out of the way, and then the felling stitches hold everything in place. You could theoretically use a felling stitch that shows as a pick stitch on the outside, but that technique is really something that happens more in the 18th century and not so much in the 16th and 17th centuries. Here's the look of the sleeve lining in place as it's done. Let's continue to work on the sleeve here. So in this instance, we're going to pull the lining out of the way and fold the sleeve so that right sides are together. So the outside faces are on the inside here. We're right sides together. And then we are going to baste the hind seam together. The hind seam is the open edge. We're going to baste along there and then stitch it with a back stitch. Next, we're going to stitch the hind seam of the lining in the same way, using a running back stitch. And once we're done with both of those, then we can pull the basting, press the seam allowances open, and then turn the lining and exterior correct for each other so that we're nested together. Once that's done, the top of the sleeve can be basted closed. At the top of the wrist opening, we're also going to put a little bar tack, which is just 3 stitches taken in one place and then covered with buttonhole stitches. This adds a little bit of security to the top of the sleeve opening and prevents it from wearing out. Now we're going to move on to the body of the garment, so you can set the sleeves and the skirts aside and pick up the back. First, we're going to line up the center back edges and baste closed, and then we're going to stitch it carefully with a back stitch. Now this back stitch can be nice and strong. It's a stress point across the back of the garment. Once the seam is sewn, we take it to the iron and we give a good press flat first and then we press it open. This helps crimp the thread in place and gives it a little bit more crisp durability. This is what it looks like from the outside once it's sewn. Attaching the front collar is our next step, but before we can do that, we need to stretch the front neckline a little bit. The pattern has been developed so that the collar is slightly longer than the neckline of the doublet. So we take the doublet front to the iron and we stretch the back 2/3 of the front neckline so that we have room to attach the collar. Once that's done, then we can just put the collar on and backstitch carefully in place. You see it basted here and then stitched carefully with a backstitch. Once we are done with that, then we clip the neckline side of those seams and press them open. For extra decorative element, we can add a pick stitch. Here you see it being executed as a very spaced back stitch, and once we've done it on both sides, we have a nice attractive edge that's going to look really beautiful sitting on the body. Now, very often in historical garments, you'll see this done as a full back stitch instead of a pick stitch. There are lots of different variations. There are extant garments which show this treatment, but it's absolutely optional. Unlike a lot of modern sewing methods where you stitch the seam on the inside and press the seam allowance open, we have other options when we're sewing a garment completely by hand. A common practice for sewing a side back seam in the 16th century would be to lap the front onto the back. So in this instance, we simply have to press the seam allowance of the side back for the front up, and then we make a corresponding mark on the back. Now the way I'm doing this here is by using my awl and making a scored line in the silk, and then I'm basting a line onto that scored line. So I'm not actually using a marking tool per se, no pencil or pen or anything. Once I have that in place, then I can line the front up onto the back in this way. You can see the back is eased down slightly here. The front is at the bottom, back is at the top. Once that's basted into place, then I can begin my stitching. Now I do two different passes of stitching here, beginning with a felling stitch along the edge, as you see here, very carefully spaced, no more than 1/8 of an inch between the stitches, and then I follow that up by doing a pick stitch alongside it, so about 1/8 of an inch away as well, so that I have this nice attractive seam that's done in two passes, completely from the outside of the garment, and it really gives a good clean finish and a nice strong wear to the garment. From here a little bit further away, you can see how that easing is evenly distributed along the stitching. It really does contribute to a nice rounded back, which makes room for all of the musculature, and when it's complete, it looks really nice to the eye. Here's a nice bird's eye view of the main body of the doublet before it's assembled with the shoulders. You can see the shape of the armhole, you can see the front collars attached to the fronts, and you can see how the back has a little bit of fullness in it and is going to be quite rounded. Our next step is going to be attaching the skirts to the main body. We haven't closed the shoulders yet, and you can see that I've basted the skirts in place, but I'm leaving the front 2 inches, about 5 centimeters, and this is because we're going to fold the lining back and we're going to stitch this in a different way. As we assemble the main portion of the skirt, we can have the lining and the stitching go all the way through it, but right here for these 2 inches, we're only going to backstitch through the main shell of the skirt and the main shell of the body, leaving the lining free. The reason for this is after we're done sewing the skirts on, we're going to clip the seam allowance here and we're going to press this open. It helps reduce a lot of bulk at the center front point where the doublet curves down into the PEASCOD. One of the biggest problems that people have with building these kinds of garments is how thick that point is and how difficult it can be. So we make this clip and then we press the seam allowance open just in those 5 centimeters at center front, and then we let the lining fall on top of those to cover them up, and we have a nice smooth transition from the front into the skirt. Closing the shoulders is nearly identical to closing the side back seam, with the major difference being that in this case the back is being set onto the front instead of vice versa, which is how we sewed the back seam. So we make our mark and we baste our line here that you can see is already done, and then we go to the back piece and we clip the seam allowance in the deepest part of the curve and press it back. With that pressed back, we're then ready to baste that in place onto the front shoulder and neckline, and you can see right here how it looks before stitching, and then we begin with our fell stitching and our pick stitching just as we did in the side back seam. It results in a very crisp, clean body and an attractive look. Here's the body as it looks from an aerial view. Our binding was made from the scraps of the fabric in video number 1. Now, it partially straight grain, partially bias grain. It's all over the place because it's cut from the scraps. Now we only stitch this about 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch in from the edge so that we have a nice thin crisp edge. And once we have it all in place, we press it back and then fold it to the back side and catch stitch in place. The skirting will be hemmed down on top of this to cover it at center front, but the rest of it we can catch stitch along the edges to secure it in place. We're switching back to video content now. So I ended up accidentally going too far with this. I have to pull my stitches out from the left front because the left front is going to be faced with a piece of wool under the buttonholes. Now, this technique comes to us from a surviving set of garments in Germany from the late 16th century, and they're summer doublets that are made very much like this. They use a piece of heavily fulled wool behind the buttonholes. Rather than canvas and a bunch of other layers, it's just this single layer that's nice and lightweight. So I have this piece of red wool melton that I'm going to stitch in place. I've pulled the binding out and I've got the binding is sort of folded to the back here behind my hands. And now I'm stitching this wool in place along the edge. Now I'm going to go from top to bottom. I have a little piecing that I use when I got all the way to the top of the neck because I didn't have quite long enough strip. Once that's complete, then I'm going to roll the binding to the back side and hem it down just like I would a normal bound finish. The binding is just double folded and then secured. This technique that I'm doing right here, do you see how I'm pinning this to my leg, pinning it to my clothes? And that's going to anchor the sewing so that I can pull against it while I'm doing my stitches. And this helps me keep the fabric in tension so that my stitches are nice and even and then the layers don't shift. It really does help in the speed of sewing and I highly recommend it. It can't be beat. So here I've begun to do the final roll of the binding to the back side and I'm stitching it in place. And I'll go ahead and do this stitching all the way up to the top of the collar. Now the facing that goes in the top of the collar is going to stop short of the buttonhole area where the red wool is, but for now I just want a nice clean snug finish on that exterior edge. I like having the red wool on the inside. There's a green surviving doublet that has a piece of red wool used underneath the buttonholes. I felt like it seemed like the thing to do. With the buttonhole facing complete and stitched in place, now I'm marking the buttonholes. And this I'm doing with a friction pen. Those of you who aren't familiar with friction, that's F-R-I-X-I-O-N. It is a pen that disappears with heat, so it's really good for drawing fine lines, for doing detail work, and then it disappears with a hot iron. So I'm marking the buttonholes in place, and then I'm going to grab my buttonhole chisel and my cutting board and a hammer, and I'll begin to work through all the buttonholes, chopping them open carefully so that they're ready for me to stitch with the buttonhole twist. Now I already have plenty of buttonhole tutorials on my YouTube channel, so I'm not going to get too deep into the hows of this. I'm just going to say we're going to start stitching the buttonholes. They've all been cut open, and I am running my thread underneath the silk, getting to the buttonhole area, and then, oops, I forgot to put a knot on the end. So let me try that again. And here we go. Good. So now I'm going to strand the buttonhole by going from one end across the tip and then across the other side. And I'll do that twice before I proceed with the buttonhole stitches. Now buttonhole stitches aren't like normal blanket stitches. They have an extra purl wrap in them. Please see my other videos for a more detailed explanation of how they work. Of course, there are also different kinds of buttonholes for different purposes. This one is a very quick buttonhole. I'm skipping a couple of steps to reinforce the hole because I don't need to. The wool on the back side just makes all of this go so much easier. I highly recommend trying it like this. Now that I've got the buttonhole stranded, I am going to come up through the throat of the buttonhole here, through the opening, and then I'm going to start my stitching by putting the needle up and wrapping the thread And I'll proceed this way around the whole buttonhole, working a little bit of an extra bar tack at the end. Once again, if you need more information on the specifics of buttonholes, please feel free to watch some of these other videos. As I complete the buttonhole, then I'm going to plunge my needle through to the back side. Here you can see the red wool on the back all nice and clear. And then I'm going to take a little stitch in one place, and then I'm going to run the needle underneath the stitches kind of into the wool to bury the tail of the buttonhole twist. And then I'll just cut it close, and that'll be done. I always make a habit of starting at the bottom of the garment and working my way up to the top because my buttonholes get better as I go, so the bottom one's kind of a warm-up. Here you can see the inside of the doublet and the way the red strip just kind of sits there. Now the lining will be sewn down onto the red strip, and the whole thing will end up looking quite nice and sleek without the red showing on the outside at all when it's complete. I think it's a really nice addition to the interior of the garment, and a lot of the elements that come from these German doublets are so easy and simple to do. There's lots of reasons behind that I can't discuss now because I don't want to get outside of the research that's being done by my colleague. So more to come on that. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next installment where we'll finish this garment up.